The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to give folks just a few more minutes to join. We'll be starting the webinar just a minute or two after 11. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's first of two PARMA COVID conversation series, COVID-19 Safety and Facility Considerations. We're pleased to present these webinars providing topic-specific conversations on the various aspects of dealing with the pandemic. The PARMA community consists of many different types of agencies and operations, and they all have their unique challenges. The goal through these webinars is to help public agencies and others be confident in their response decisions. Thanks to PARMA for partnering with us, and we're happy to be here. Presenting today will be FACS Chief Science Officer Ben Kollmeyer and Senior Project Manager Michelle Rosales. Ben is a certified industrial hygienist, has his master's in public health, and has extensive experience in the environmental health arena, conducting hundreds of investigations involving a variety of physical, chemical, and biological hazards in occupational and community settings. Ben routinely consults in both the public and private sector, performing field investigations and developing prevention and management programs. Michelle is also a certified industrial hygienist and has her master's in public health and has over 15 years of experience in the environmental health and industrial hygiene service arenas and frequently performs in-depth investigative research and sampling, data interpretation, and preparation of reports with recommendations and conclusions. Both Ben and Michelle are also key members of the FACS COVID-19 emergency response team. Before I hand it off to Ben and Michelle, though, I'd like to quickly cover a few components of the webinar platform we're using today, GoToWebinar. Everyone is in listen-only mode, but this does not mean that we can't communicate with you. As you think of questions that come up for our presenters throughout the webinar, please enter them in the question box that you see in the control panel on your screen. You forward one slide, Michelle, they'll be able to see that. Perfect. Feel free to enter any questions in there, choose send questions to staff, and we'll have time for a question and answer session following the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle and Ben. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. As we get started, just a quick word for all of us to remind us why we're here and why we're listening to this. As folks that are in charge of managing facilities and us as consultants on advising people, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it's our job to do what we can to stop people from becoming infected with this virus. And so the objective here in this webinar is to learn what we can do to help educate ourselves, members of our team, those to report to us, on what they can do to improve public health in the environment, and help support the greater public good during this pandemic. So Michelle, to you for what we're going to be talking about here.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone today for coming into listening of this presentation. We're going to begin a little bit with some COVID basics. I know you've probably heard a lot about COVID already, but again, what's a COVID presentation without giving the basics at the beginning? And we want to kind of go over a little bit of the facility's role in the fight against COVID. So we'll talk a little bit about HVAC considerations, some of the custodial practices in performing enhanced cleaning, some of the general building management side of things and considerations that you may want to think about before entering and during occupancy of the building. And then also going over some of the staff safety. So you're playing the role as trying to protect the individuals in the buildings, but we also need to think about the safety of you as well. So COVID basics. So again, we've heard of the word coronavirus. It's also known as SARS-CoV-2, which stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, coronavirus 2. Fun fact again, if you don't know, COVID-19 actually stands for the CO for corona, VI for virus, D stands for the disease, and 19 refers to 2019 in which it was first identified. So COVID-19 is a disease that is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. I just saw on the news today that they were trying to do links between breast milk and transmission of the coronavirus, but it's important to know that the main transmission is person to person. So when you are releasing respiratory droplets by coughing, speaking, or sneezing, and then another individual coming into that space and then inhaling through either their respiratory system or maybe potentially through their eyes, and transmitting it that way. So that's why we always get the term close contact, where we talk about someone within a 6-foot radius. There's also additional and re-emerging research coming out talking about also transmission through aerosols. So these smaller particulates, not the large respiratory droplets, but the small particulates that are also being released during the sneezing, the coughing, and the talking. Another form of transmission is also the surface transmission. So an individual may be coughing onto a surface, another individual then touches it with their hands and then transmits the virus through their mouth and nose and the eyes. So these are all different forms of the transmission, but again, it's important to know that the main one is the person-to-person contact, and then secondly, the surface transmission. I really like this slide a lot because, again, we keep talking about this 6-foot distance, but it's important to know that a sneeze can travel a lot further than 6 feet. So that 6 feet is not a barrier that, you know, makes and protects you from potentially, transmitting or getting the virus. So there was an MIT study that showed that a sneeze can transfer over 26 feet in distance. So it's very important that you do your face coverings and protect yourselves with all the different various exposure controls that we'll go over in this presentation.
When we talk about what we can do to protect ourselves from coronavirus as environmental health professionals, industrial hygienists, we think about what we call the hierarchy of controls that applies to a lot of hazards. So in the context of coronavirus, we can think of it as how do we intervene? And the preferred method that we intervene by is trying to eliminate the hazard, just keeping people away from each other. So working remotely, it can be argued about what type of control it is. We see it as an elimination of the hazard. You keep people completely away from each other, eliminate that need for interaction, we're eliminating the hazard. A lot of what we do in the facilities realm falls in that yellow band of engineering controls. Those are fixed things that are out there that are set that don't rely upon human intervention exactly, that helps to control exposure. A lot of what we hear about is relying on administrative controls or the ways that people work, relying on people's behaviors to protect us, such as the distancing, washing their hands, those types of things. And then finally, kind of the least preferred method is a form of protective equipment Because if that, like an N95 respirator, let's say, because if that protective equipment fails, there's nothing left to prevent the exposure from happening. So when we think about the better things that we can do, our opportunity to eliminate them or engineer out the hazards are preferred over things that rely upon behavior modification or PPE. Although we're going to be relying on a mix of all of these things to help control COVID. So let's talk, in our topics here, let's talk a little bit about HVAC considerations, jumping right into some of these facility concerns. Next slide, Michelle. There's a lot of guidance out there, primarily on HVAC from the CDC. They have language. It varies depending on what industry sector you look in. On the CDC website under general industry, there's some guidance. And then various specific industries or settings like office buildings will have slightly different language about ventilation systems, HVAC systems, but it's all more or less saying the same thing, although the exact words are a little different. Same thing at the state level. The states tend to be a little less specific, and there may be some local regulations. What the CDC is driving to, and a lot of them are pointing back to, is ASHRAE. That produces a lot of guidance with regard to engineered systems and ventilation systems in particular. And we've listed for you here a few of the key documents that really get into the nitty-gritty on controlling infectious aerosols. Some updated this spring for COVID specifically. Next slide, Michelle. So in a nutshell, what are the basics of what this guidance is saying? So it uses the various guidance uses the word consider a lot. Facilities managers should consider doing X, Y, and Z. So it gives you the flexibility. It doesn't say you have to do it, but it kind of, why aren't you doing it? So it's not exactly doing you a lot of favors, but it does open the door that, hey, maybe all of these aren't possible, maybe all of them aren't needed, but that you should take a look at your ability to do these. So we kind of approach this as do the best you can as practicable with these various things. And there's four basics that they have. One is improving ventilation and airflow management, improving filtration, and then looking at portable HEPA filtration or UVGI, ultraviolet germicidal radiation of upper rooms. So we're going to hit on each of these briefly. Next slide, please. So when we talk about ventilation, this is how much fresh air we're bringing into a building. So how much old air are we throwing out? How much new air are we bringing in? And so all the guidance says you should consider increasing ventilation potentially up to 100%. Well, we all know, depending on our climate, it's summertime here in Southern California, where Michelle and I are at, humidity is relatively high. When it's 100 degrees with high humidity and you go 100% outdoor air, you're going to have a heck of a time controlling temperature. You may get a lot of condensation and moisture related issues in a building, and you're going to use a lot more energy. So how much you can open ventilation is, I would say, as much as you can before running into those significant issues with comfort, moisture, or energy use. Whereas normally we want to keep doors and windows closed to let the HVAC system do its thing to control the environment. In this setting, we're trying to do as much ventilating as we can. So if you can open those windows and doors, get that outdoor air blowing in, the better. They all caveat to watch your outdoor air quality. If your facility is next to a freeway or a pollution source, it may not be wise to bring in more outdoor air. And so through natural ventilation. So you have to consider what the outdoor air quality is like. A couple other things to keep in mind is just based on the fact that we have less people in our buildings, most likely, than before COVID, that is increasing the amount of fresh air per person. So just by having reduced occupancies, you're effectively increasing your ventilation. There's also discussion of extending hours of operation to allow more air exchanges to occur in the off hours to kind of get rid of the old air and bring in new air. Most recently saying 2 hours on each end. Also thinking about and adjusting ventilation, what's your ability to do this? Some of you may have electronically controlled air dampers. Others, you may have to get up on the roof and move a bolt to increase it an unknown amount. But the idea is take a look and say, hey, we're going to make an increase in ventilation over what we're doing now so that we can say we have increased ventilation and fiddle with it to get as much as you can. And finally, in this arena, they talk about airflow management of trying to move air from more clean areas with respect to COVID to less clean. So where there's low occupancy loads, trying to get the air to move from low occupancy load areas to high occupancy load areas. This is probably going to be pretty challenging because building ventilation systems really aren't designed to do this unless they've been purpose-built. But on a small scale, looking at perhaps if you have isolation areas for COVID cases, blocking off your supplies and returns. If you have a reception area, a public area, maybe doing something where you can, close off or adjust some dampers on supply and returns in those areas to not circulate it through. Some pretty rudimentary things might be able to help with those pressure relationships, but can get fairly complex. Next slide, Michelle.
I would like to add something real quick too about the outdoor air quality. I think today there was over 30 active wildfires occurring in California, so that is definitely going to be an issue. Generally with residential, they already tell you to shut your doors and run your system so that it's, a closed system and the air is just recirculating through filters. But generally, you're still wanting outdoor air for a lot of commercial buildings. So that's you got to outweigh the hazards. So that's definitely going to be an issue for the next couple of months, I'm guessing, for California.
Yeah, and depending on if you're in the Bay Area right now, the wildfire particulate is probably creating a greater health hazard than the COVID risk. That's been the guidance from public health up there, is to don't let the particulate in, just kind of compounds the problem.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, talking a little bit about filtration. So again, we want to improve filtration. So one thing they say is make sure your filters are fit well so that the air is going through the filter and not around them, which is a very common problem. Should be fit well anyway, so now's a good time to check with COVID to make sure it's working right. So when we anytime we increase filtration, we're going to increase the pressure drop across the filter most of the time. And so that's going to result in airflow reduction, which goes in the face of increasing ventilation. So you want to balance this in getting better filtration without significantly reducing airflow. And a lot of that's going to depend on what the fan in your HVAC unit can handle and if it can maintain the airflows that you're looking for. When you go to new filters, probably some increased energy consumption. And you also have to think about with increasing the quality of your filters, how much is that going to cost and what's the availability? So the guidance is all saying, hey, increase filtration up to MERV 13, which is what's used in a lot of healthcare settings. However, from talking to various clients, they say, yeah, that sounds great. They're on a 90-day back order for MERV 13 filters for our unit. So you're going to have to do the best you can. Maybe you can get to MERV 9 or 10. Maybe you're going to have to wait a while for this. But that's where that consider clause, comes into play, and you're doing what you can that's practical. So a lot of talk about MERV ratings and MERV 13. I've given you a reference from the National Air Filtration Association that kind of helps explain it. I'm going to show you a couple graphics. Next slide, Michelle. This one, we're not going to go through the whole thing here, but there's one column there is called typical applications. And this shows the MERV rating in the gray band on the side and the typical applications. So most commercial buildings are going to be running MERV 8s, 5 to 8s. And so you see that's listed as commercial workplaces, right? Industrial commercial workplaces. So getting into the MERV 9 to 12 range, that's generally characterized as better industrial, better commercial workplaces. And so if you can move from that range of 5 to 8 to 9 to 12, you're kind of going into that, you're a better commercial workplace in terms of filtration. And then by the time you get to MERV 13, you'd be in the bucket of a superior commercial building. So just to kind of give some sense of what's being used where from an organization that gives you something to go on, even if you can't get to MERV 13, maybe you can kind of get into the next tier to be one of those better type of buildings for managing your filtration. Next slide. Next slide, there we go. So in the nitty gritty, we're not going to spend a lot of detail. Here's the key thing on filtration to remember. Particles, the SARS-CoV-2 viruses, I think a little bit over 0.1 microns in aerodynamic diameter. The most difficult particle size to filter is actually 0.3. So things smaller than 0.3 are actually easier to filter out. So it's kind of this low point in the particle size for physics reasons that we won't get into. So another thing to remember is, although the virus is very small, it's we're probably not passing infection from free-floating viruses. We're passing infection from viruses that are in respiratory droplets or aerosols. So they're in a drop of spit, essentially, right? And so those particles can be a variety of ranges. So when we try to increase filtration, we're not necessarily targeting that 0.1 micrometer size of the virus. We're trying to get a whole size range of spit particulates, basically. And so this chart shows you how they start to increase. And by the time you get to MERV 13, you're filtering out about 50% of those most difficult to filter particles, and your efficiency in all other particle sizes increase as well. So the bottom line is, the higher you go on the MERV rating, the better you're filtering out particles of a variety of sizes, and the more likely you are to be filtering out potentially infectious SARS-CoV-2 particles. Next, Michelle. Portable HEPA filtration. This is another one of those consider, right? So these are a unit, a standalone unit you throw into a room that would circulate the air in the room and clean the air in the room. This is, ASHRAE points to this as that there's some evidence that this is effective, kind of their evidence level B, and so it's something that they say should be considered. What I've listed here are a variety of factors to consider when you look at these. How much of an impact on transmission are they going to have? We don't really know. If you're sitting next to someone who's coughing with COVID, having a HEPA air cleaner might not do you that much good if you're close to them. If you're somewhere else in the room, maybe that general cleaning will help. We just don't know the answers yet, but it certainly is not expected to cause any harm. And we know that filtering particles with room air cleaners can also improve general indoor environmental quality by filtering out allergens and other particles. So there's some factors to consider. What size of unit to get for the room. I'll show you that in a moment. You have to think about what maintenance needs to be done on these units. How often are the filters, the pre-filters, going to be cleaned? Oftentimes they may have a HEPA filter that lasts a year that's, you know, kind of an expensive piece, but there's a pre-filter that kind of protects the HEPA filter that needs to be cleaned more regularly. So who's going to do that? How's that done? They will use energy, although that doesn't, you know, they don't use that much, but something to consider. Another thing is a lot of these air cleaners will come with an ozone generator or ionizer feature. If these ionizers generate ozone, that is not a good thing. Ozone is a pulmonary irritant and can lead to problems, and there's a long history of not recommending those to be used in air cleaners. So sometimes they're features that can be turned on and off or an option. We don't need them. Consider how much noise the unit is going to make. Some of them can be quite noisy. You have to think about how you place them in a room following the design to make sure that they maximize the mixing in the room. If you set them against a bookcase or tuck them in a corner, they're not going to be as effective as if you get them out there in the open. And finally, what we found working with clients is we don't know how effective they're going to be, but this is a very visible thing. You can change a MERV 13 filter in the ventilation unit, and no one's going to necessarily see that or know it. You put a portable HEPA air cleaner in there, that's something they see, they put their eyes on every day, that they can reach out as a tangible thing that you're doing. And sometimes that's a pretty big consideration for what to do. Next, Michelle, I think you're going to talk to us about UV. Oh, I got one more. So I talked about the size of the unit to use. This is what's called the CAD, or Clean Air Delivery Rate Rating. There's a guidance document from EPA that talks about home air cleaners, or cleaners that you use in rooms and buildings. And there is a CAD rating that's appropriate for the square footage of a different room. So something to keep in mind, they are not one size fits all. You can refer to something like this chart and make sure you get a unit with the proper CAD rating. Now, I'll dish off to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. So some of the guidance documents, specifically I know CDC's for offices, talk about considering the use of UVGI for, you know, the protection and within the HVAC system. So what it does is it inactivates the bacteria, mold spores, and fungi and viruses, so it's not allowed to replicate itself. But not all UV acts the same. We know that there's that spectrum, right? And so there's a certain range in which it'll do this germicidal work to these microorganisms. Within the UVGI, there are several different types of systems. There's one called the upper room system, where you see in this photo here where it's placed up higher in a room above people's heads somewhat, so that it's recirculating above. There are systems that are within the actual HVAC systems, but those are primarily for killing and inactivating of microorganisms at the cooling coils. And there's also the portable system. So with regards to COVID, the upper room system is a preferable one because, again, you're trying to stop the transmission. So if it's in the actual HVAC system, it doesn't necessarily have that opportunity to do that. It's focused on that specific area. But if you are having air movement with the upper room system UV, you're able to try to do a little bit more work with the control of COVID. It's also important to note that UVGI should not be a primary system. It should be a secondary system. So you still want to do all the stuff that Ben spoke about, you know, the upgrades to the HVAC system, the outdoor air, the filtration, and this is just an added component. And when I reviewed a lot of the documents talking about UVGI, because it's kind of a big thing at this point right now, they don't talk about necessarily putting it in every single room or every single location, but kind of, again, thinking of it as a secondary system and maybe concentrating on areas of concern or people who are at risk or high occupancy areas to make it more efficient and to make the cost and the, you know, putting it into your area a little bit more feasible.
Michelle, one comment on this UV. It kills can kill coronavirus, but it's not good for people too, right? So we're not
correct. Yeah, no, definitely. So it's not something you want to just go into lightly. And again, as I stated, there's different types of UV. So a lot of people, there's different brands and different ones, but it's important that you look at if it's a UVC, because that's the one that will be the inactivating of viruses and microorganisms, and then exactly what range in which it does the work. So yes, a lot goes into, again, I always like to say, don't fix a hazard by adding a hazard, right? So whenever you're adding things like this, I think you need to think long and hard of the benefits of it, because there's a lot of potential issues with safety also involved. So there's, you know, different aspects to think of. Okay, custodial staff. So as Ben showed in the hierarchy of controls, custodial staff and facilities play a major role in the fight against COVID. So custodial staff, what does that entail? Well, we know that every guidance document talks about cleaning and disinfecting, right? But what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to clean and disinfect every square inch in a facility? No, you know, that's one, not feasible, and two, it's not necessary. So what we need to do is think about what we're going to clean, when we're going to clean, and how we're going to clean. So with that, identifying what are the frequently touched surfaces in that specific area, what are the high frequency areas in a building, and making sure that we're concentrating on those locations. And then dependent on that, when are we going to clean it? Is this an area where we only need to clean once a day, or is it a surface that we know that the general public's coming in and out, that we're going to want to increase the frequency? And then again, how we're going to do that, because that's very important, because spraying a disinfectant and wiping it right away will not do what you think it's going to do. There are actual specific methods that are necessary in order to, again, inactivate the virus. Also, a very important part is the coordination. So this cannot just be the work of custodial staff, right? This is a group effort of individuals in identifying when we're going to be doing this work, and again, focusing on what, when, and how. And the disinfection products that you're going to use. We know that the EPA has a registered list of disinfectants that have been shown that it will be effective with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So identifying and making sure that you have those products available for you. And this is a great, two great forms that we have used to kind of implement custodial cleaning practices, because like I stated, we can't just assume that every surface is going to be clean. And again, with the number of custodial staff, that's not even feasible. So kind of identifying and coming up with a cleaning plan for a specific area. So again, the coordination and the discussion with those who occupy the space, because obviously they know their space better than anybody. So they're going to help assist you in identifying what surfaces need to be addressed specifically. So looking at those, maybe the equipment, the printer, is that something that people use very often? Yes, let's add that to our cleaning plan so that we're identifying these areas. And this can be used for custodial staff, but this can also be used for the actual occupants in the space as well, because again, team effort here. Everyone plays a role in the fight against COVID. So identifying what those locations are and when and how often they need to be cleaned and how. And then not only just coming up with a plan, but actually implementation of it. So this right-hand worksheet is a checklist that was created where you're using the information from the left document and putting it into a checklist and saying, yes, we've identified that this staff lounge and the touch points in this area need to be cleaned on this frequency. And then actually having documentation where people go out there and outline and notate how often they've cleaned it and when. And kind of keeping a checks and balance type situation here so that you're holding people accountable and they're documenting and you're letting them know that you're doing the work that needs to be done to try to protect them. And then this is another great document because, again, the custodial staff does such a great amount of work that's necessary, kind of giving the transparency and kind of letting the individuals in these buildings and offices understand exactly what you're doing. So you already have your routine practices that need to be performed pre-COVID, what you did on a daily basis, but kind of letting everyone know what you are doing to enhance that cleaning effort. So we know that the occupants have their role, but you have your role as well. You want to let them know that, yes, normally we would just empty trash and replace a liner in this one room, but now we are also cleaning certain locations. We're wiping away dust. We're using this type of disinfectant spray on this frequency. So allowing some transparency and showing all the great work that you're doing to protect. And then also thinking about, do you have the right tools for the job? So again, I told you about the EPA list. So ensuring that you're using the disinfectants that are appropriate for SARS-CoV-2. And ensuring that the people who are using these products have the right tools. So there's so many different applications now. People talk about foggers, electrostatic sprayers, which one's best. But when it comes down to it, it's do you have the right product? And are you making sure that it's being used in accordance with the manufacturer guidelines? So if you've ever looked on the back of a Lysol spray, you'll see that there's a specific contact time. So the disinfectant needs to be on a surface wet for a certain amount of time. It could be between 1 minute and 10 minutes. It's, differs per product, but ensuring that you're doing that appropriate contact time and not just using electrostatic sprayer, walking away and then seeing that dries in a minute when the contact said 5 minutes. So ensuring that regardless, you're looking at the way the cleaning needs to be done and ensuring the correct contact time in order for it to be effective. And then also making sure that any individual that's using these products has been trained on them. We know that disinfectants kill microorganisms, and guess what? We are all full of them as well. So we don't, there's a potential for, skin irritation, rashes, dermatitis, inhalation exposure, so that the individuals that are using these products need to be trained on the proper use of them. And then if necessary, depending on the product, what appropriate personal protective equipment is necessary. So do they need to wear some type of respiratory protection because of, the hazardous, if there's a hazard associated with it. And this is a great tool that we've showed a lot of our clients on a disinfectant guide, because there are so many different disinfectants available. And although you may like one, as Ben showed about the MERV filters, it's very hard to get disinfectants at the same time. So having a list of all the different types that you have that are effective, and then providing a little guidelines for individuals. So is this a product that can be used for porous items, or is it just for non-porous items? So you're going to want to know that. And then again, the contact time, outlining this specific product needs 5 minutes because you may have another product that needs 10 minutes. So outlining some of the user instructions and then the safety precautions, it's very helpful to give to people because, again, there's so much information, so many products being used at this time, kind of gathering all the information that's necessary for an individual to get that job done. And the last I was talking about was just the enhanced cleaning, but there may be situations in which custodial staff may be involved in case response cleanups. So it's important that when they do this work that they're doing it properly and safely. So The first part should always be the incident site risk assessment. So again, if there was a confirmed case in an office space, are we going to shut the entire building down and clean it? No, not necessarily. We're going to methodically think about where was this individual, who did they come in contact with, and what surfaces need to be addressed. So identifying the locations, the surfaces, and even within this initial portion, identifying what custodial staff's going to do it, how they're going to do it, do they have the right amount of equipment and materials to get the job done. The second stage, depending on the severity, if it was just maybe someone coughing, you don't necessarily need to do the step 2, but if maybe there was bodily fluids involved and potential contamination of the virus through bodily fluids, a pre-disinfection and gross removal step is very necessary to kind of get the bulk gross material removed and disinfected. And then for all steps, as we all know, for proper cleaning and disinfection, it always begins with the cleaning. So you want to make sure that you clean the surface first using first a dry method, then a wet method, which can be like a mild detergent, and then going into the proper disinfection phase and using the products that we previously showed on the last slide. And within all of these steps, we need to think about not doing cross-contamination, ensuring that we are maybe using a vast amount of cleaning wipes so that we're not cleaning one area and then potentially contaminating another area, but coming up with a game plan so that we are doing it in the best way possible. And then after the process, making sure that we have a post-site assessment. So ensuring that what we've done was appropriate and then documenting everything as necessary.
Okay, well, let's talk about general building management. So from a facility standpoint, we're in charge of maintaining the building, right? There's various occupants occupying different suites or areas of the building that have their own protocols and their own safe practices for taking care of the people in those areas. But what about the hallways and the common areas of the building itself? That's typically falling to facilities. So Michelle, if we can go to the next slide. One thing, one thing is, especially early on when we're under lockdown, you may have a lot of buildings that are closed or going to be coming online over time. So whenever we have an extended building closure, besides the hazards associated with SARS-CoV-2, we don't need additional problems. So you have to think about the steps when you're closing a building from an environmental health perspective. What are you doing before closure? Have you gotten rid of all the perishables? How are you going to maintain the water system, the HVAC system during this closure? Stagnant water system is not good. One of the primary concerns is Legionnaires, Legionella and Legionnaire's disease. A lot of discussion during this pandemic about that from EPA. Concerns potentially about lead in water from systems that are sitting with stagnant water for a long time. And then keeping those HVAC systems functioning and running at a minimal level to keep the building healthy. So during a closure period, doing routine inspections to make sure we're not getting water intrusion or catching problems as they come up, staying on top of pest control, probably going to be doing routine flushing of water systems to keep that water moving and having the HVAC system operate on minimum settings. And then finally, before bringing people back in, doing a walkthrough, taking care of those obvious problems, doing a flush of the water system, purging out the building, getting the ventilation system back up and running, possibly doing some additional cleaning, and then having a plan in place for evaluating, especially during those first few weeks when people come back in to jump on any problems that are uncovered. Going on to the next slide, when it comes to actually getting ready to reopen, getting our building ready for people to come back in from a COVID-19 perspective. So the approach we've taken is develop a checklist approach of things to consider, kind of a checklist to walk through and go through a building and document that has been looked at and addressed to kind of get that building up and running. So we've developed some various checklists and forms so you can do that in a methodical way for your different facilities. Next slide. What's in this checklist? We'll cover some of the basics. So the sections are first considering medical screening. Are you putting postings about symptoms on the front doors coming into the building? Is that facility going to be having screening checks at the front door? A lot of issues that go into that need to be decided, but is that something that's happening from a facility standpoint, or is that being left to the individual occupants of the building? Second category, physical distancing. We're looking at how does traffic move through the common area of our buildings? Do we need wait here lines, lineup lines for the elevators? Is there an entry and an exit point? Those types of things. Looking at the common areas, if there's seating or how things are set up to try to minimize interactions, taking seating out of commission, marking sit here locations and the like. If there are shared break rooms or work rooms, determining what the occupancy of those should be and what practice should be followed in them. And then from a facility standpoint, if you're a person in charge of a given building, even though there may be multiple entities or parties working within that building, whose responsibility is it to coordinate between them to maybe arrange for staggered start times or different activities so that someone has to coordinate what's happening with all the occupants in the building to get them on the same page to minimize the interactions between folks. From a personal hygiene perspective, for our buildings in these common areas, making sure we have hand sanitizer appropriately located and stocked, touchless systems for delivery of this sanitizer, paper towels and the like. And if there's any type of communal items, whether giveaways, freebies, things that people may be taking, is it time to eliminate those or cut back on those or turn them into individual aliquots instead of having people all draw from a bigger collection? And then finally, postings about proper hand washing throughout the building as well. Next slide. With protective equipment, the big one there is face coverings, putting that posting on the door, asking people to wear them. Are you going to be implementing controls on the front doors? Is there going to be someone there policing the use of masks and not letting people in concurrent with doing maybe a symptoms check? As Michelle talked about for environmental cleaning, we need to have a detailed plan for the common areas in the building and make sure the supplies are there and that we're documenting that cleaning's done. And then finally, we got to think about specifically how are our restrooms set up for people to use them safely, our reception desk areas to protect those workers. Do we need barriers in place for people working reception desks? How about a plan for elevators? Can be a very complex issue. CDC has recently added some more language finally about elevator guidance into their guidance document under office spaces. And there's also some guidance from the National Elevator Industry Group, which I have a link for you here in a moment. Also remember, if we're talking about a building, we may also have parking structures with elevators and railings and things that need to be cleaned out as well as outdoor seating areas or lounging areas that we don't want to forget about. Finally, if we're running a facility, we may be very likely to have vendors coming in to help maintain the facilities. So making sure there's proper protocols for managing our vendors and their safety precautions as they come on. And then going through and doing routine inspections to make sure that these things are being done and seeing how we can improve. Next slide, Michelle. Example of some of the postings may have the one there with the diagram shows what might be a posting for an elevator of where people to stand, along with some locations or some instructions on how to use the elevator safely. Similarly, a restroom posting saying the do's and don'ts you put on the restroom door or how people should use the restrooms. Next slide, Michelle. And then we talked about doing inspections, having some basic form with some checkoff items on the things to check to make sure the facility is still set up to appropriately manage things. Are those markings still, traffic flow markings still in place? Is the cleaning being done and the like? So that's kind of some of the fundamentals of how we would go through and get a building set up to welcome occupants back.
Thank you, and I'm going to end with some safe work practices for the facilities staff, because there is a general amount of controls and things that we can do as employees, but there are, specifics for facilities that make them a little bit different in situations that we can go over. So OSHA has a classification for exposure risk for occupations when discussing COVID. They have a low, medium, high, and very high. For general industry, they talk about very high being healthcare settings. But they also have an example for environmental service tasks. So the lower range would be if you're doing just routine cleaning in a low volume office or building or commercial area that's not really occupied heavily by the public. The medium range would be those doing routine cleaning in higher frequency locations, high density populations, and high would be those who are actually cleaning bodily fluids. So if you think about a typical custodial staff member just doing enhanced cleaning, they're probably in the low range the majority of time, unless it's a highly occupied building with a lot of the general public coming in and out. But typically they'll be in that low range, maybe medium range. But doing maybe case responses, they may be in this higher range, or a plumber who may be exposed to sewage, and there's information saying that COVID can be passed through feces, so that they would maybe be in a higher exposure range when they're doing those type of work tasks. So what are safe work practices? So we can't do just one of these, right? We all know that we need to entail all of these, implement all of these elements in order to protect ourselves. So we always need to do medical screening, physical distancing, personal hygiene, protective equipment, and environmental cleaning. We can't just put a mask on and say that we're being protected. As Ben showed in the hierarchy of controls, the medical screening. If a sick person doesn't come to work, then we've eliminated COVID from coming into the workplace from that individual. So ensuring that people aren't coming to work if they've been sick or if they've been exposed to an individual. Physical distancing, as we showed that 6 feet is a number that people state, but doesn't necessarily mean that that's the barrier in which you are protected from COVID. So trying to go and be away from people as much as possible. So I know in facility departments, a lot of people tend to work together. So they will travel in cars, in work trucks together, do processes together. We discourage that, especially if it's not necessary. If there's maybe a task where there's another safety issue, maybe electricians that need 2 individuals in that space, then yes, we do agree that they can work together, and then we just maybe up some of the safe practices in terms of protective equipment, wearing respirators in order to protect them because they're closer. But we need to try to do the physical distancing as much as possible, because it's important to know, again, if a worker comes, with a confirmed case, we need to go back and do contact tracing. How many other individuals at the work did they become in close contact with? And if they're riding in cars together, let me tell you, that means they're in close contact. So we need to think about this as much as possible to try to reduce the amount of physical interaction with coworkers or other individuals at all. So maybe having your initial meetings in the morning over a Zoom meeting or through walkie-talkies or in a location where people can spread out as far as possible. Again, encouraging that no breaks or lunches are taken together, staggering shifts. All of this information's been put on various guidance documents, but again, custodial staff, I think one of the biggest issues is trying to get people not to work together. One option would be, if you have a custodial staff cleaning, putting up a sign when they're in a room so that others aren't coming into the space while they're doing their work. They can clean a office space without other individuals impeding on their area. And then personal hygiene, that stays the same for everyone. Just make sure you're not, discourage the use of sharing of tools. We know that there's some fancy pieces of equipment that might have to be shared between employees, but if that's going to be done, ensuring that it's cleaned and disinfected before and after use properly. The protective equipment, as I stated, everybody's wearing face coverings at this point in California. But if you have those situations where people do need to work together, now we need to talk about wearing actual respirators, the N95 or higher, so that when they are working close to one another, they're being protected at the same time with regard to COVID. And then again, the environmental cleaning that we went over in detail. So all of these work practices need to be put in place together for them to be effective.
And just to elaborate on what Michelle was saying, think about this from, first and foremost, to keep our employees and people safe. But you can also think about it from a business continuity standpoint. If you have your plumbing or your HVAC teams that are working together and have close contact, and one of those people gets sick, when they do the contact tracing and say who is exposed, and these exposed people need to remain at home for 14 days, you can very rapidly find yourself in a position where you have no HVAC techs or you have no plumbers. And that's going to have serious implications for how you maintain operations in your facility. So keeping those teams, getting them to follow those practices, so if you do have a case, you don't take down your whole crew, is critically important. And finally, you know, we talk about these things in the context of protecting our teams. Remember, they're going out into the workplaces for everyone else in our businesses, and so there's a lot of visibility to the maintenance staff, and seeing them take good precautions. You know, they can be seen as the outsider coming into someone's bubble, and so you know, showing the facilities is operating safely can help give our stakeholders assurances and confidence that things are being managed right. Big part of it.
Agreed. And that is it. Time for questions.
Great. We've got quite a few questions that came in, so I'll just start with them. As MERV ratings increase, the fan and related equipment can be impacted or damaged, correct? Can you review quickly that an HVAC engineer should be consulted, etc.?
So anytime we're increasing filtration, you're going to create a greater pressure drop across the filter, which means the fan's going to have to work a little harder. Some units are going to be able to handle that no problem. Others are going to cough, sputter, and die, right? So working with your HVAC engineer or your vendors to see what that pressure drop is going to be and how your equipment can handle it is going to be something that's done on a case-by-case basis. Just depends. Sometimes they can't handle the filters, sometimes they can. So it's kind of one of those things that has to be evaluated.
Okay. How does UVGI compare to regular sunlight in effectiveness?
The sun does play a role, and it does have that UVC in there. So actually having a system that's more concentrated in a specific location is how it's more beneficial than the sun. But yeah, it can do the same properties.
Great.
But they cannot be used for tanning purposes, right, Michelle?
Bummer.
No, but it's more, sorry, let me elaborate. Sorry. Because the sun produces so many UV rays, the UVGI does go specific to that. Generally, I think it's a 254 nanometer range and just does what it's supposed to do in terms of germicidal irradiation.
Great. And can you cover what the risk to people is for UVGI?
Well, I know that UV does produce ozone. And also, again, there's just the issue, just think about when the sun itself, right? It burns and it can burn your skin and cause irritation. So there's both ozone and the burning and the skin contact issue.
So when you apply these systems, that's why they call them upper room. It's not something where you're irradiating people. They're typically isolated to where people are not being exposed to the UV rays.
Correct. So yeah, so before you put any system in, you have to do your due diligence and research and identifying how it should be used and how to properly use it. It's not something to come lightly into, as we discussed, controlling a hazard with another hazard. Same thing with chemicals, right? So chemicals and disinfectants are nasty products where they're killing microorganisms. So when you're going to be using them, you need to make sure that you're properly trained and using the correct products in the way they're supposed to be used.
Okay, this one's worded a little differently, so bear with me here. How important is the MERV rating for the central air handler filters where VAV boxes locally recirculate air via the plenum, typically without any filtration?
Okay, so it's going to depend on how the system is set up. If there's no filtration in the local, so for the filter to be effective, right, the air has to pass through it. So on the central systems, it just depends on how it's designed, right? If it's pulling in, if all you're filtering is the outdoor air, then I'd say moving to MERV 13 isn't all that important because we're not concerned about massive amounts of COVID-19 floating around the outdoor air. So if you were in a situation where your central filters are only filtering outdoor air, then I probably wouldn't worry about going to MERV 13 from a COVID standpoint. What's important is that air that's being recirculated through the building, that's what you want to have clean. So if it's a mix of the two, it just depends on, how much of that mixing occurs. So the more air you can filter with a MERV 13, the better. But again, it's that recirculated portion where someone is exhaling it somewhere in the building, it's getting recirculated, filtered, and then coming back out through a supply.
Great. The next question, there's been lots of questions from staff about using fans in classrooms. Can you speak to this?
So the use of fans, there's kind of a pro and a con to it, right? The concern is you don't want to blow spit from one person towards another person, but at the same time you want to produce air movement. So if you have windows open and you can blow air in, that would generally be seen as a good thing, but you don't want to be the person that's downstream getting other people's exhalations blown onto you. So it's very positional, if you will. I was just advising someone the other day about a classroom or a teacher with a window, and I indicated, well, if you put a fan on the window and it's blowing outdoor air across your desk, but across the front of the room and not from your desk onto other students, that probably makes sense. It would probably look bad if you had a fan blowing outside across you and then blowing directly onto students from there. So that's what you want to think about, right? Is we don't want to put someone at greater risk than another person. So the more they're used for general air circulation and not not moving it from one person to another. That's when the fan issue comes up. That's why in some cases fans are discouraged. So that's what you're trying to avoid. But it all depends on how the fan's set up and where the people are sitting. So.
Great. Recommendations for filter disposal of filters post-COVID life?
Normal. This is not biohazardous waste.
Great. Any PPE recommendations for staff entering HVAC systems or working on rooftops near AHU?
So the AHU air handling units, right? So staff that are going into large air handling units or that are passing by the exhaustive air handling units, I would say they should be using the same type of protective equipment that they would be using pre-COVID, and with this exception. If the exhaust from that area is an area that's known to, like from a COVID isolation room, then probably an N95 respirator and eye coverings would be best. Technically, when you go into a running HVAC system, assuming it's safe to do so, there could be particulate and things blowing around in there. If there's a large population, wearing that respiratory protection probably makes sense. It probably makes sense anyway for folks to be doing it, and so COVID can add a little bit to it.
Great. Are the UV wands effective?
Yes. So you can use a portable unit and the wands, and they can be effective, but obviously that would take a long period of time to go over it. And if you're thinking of just quick and easy, it may be doable, but I don't see them being a very large scale cleaning method that would be useful with regard to COVID. I mean, it's kind of plus,
it's not like Men in Black where you're going to go into a room and zap it and all of a sudden it's free of COVID. This stuff takes time to work, and it has to have residency time. So it's something that you set up. When you set it up in there, unless people are wearing protective, eyewear and skin wear, they can't hang out in there when it's done. And so those wands, while they can be effective in specific applications, I don't imagine your custodians going in and waving the wand over desks and magically disinfecting everything, right, Michelle?
Yeah, correct. And there's also issues of shadowing. You already have to clean the surface first, so any particulate can be removed before you do the actual disinfection of the surface. So there's shadowing when you're dealing with UV, so if it didn't hit that area, then it doesn't effectively disinfect it or irradiate the virus. So.
And another misconception people have sometimes, as Michelle described, UV systems can be used on cooling coils to control microorganism growth on coils or fouling of coils. But the idea that the air passing through the ductwork can go through like a UV chamber and kill everything in the air, it's theoretically achievable, but you have to look at the residency time of the air in the duct. And the air in the duct is typically moving pretty quick. So you need a really long tunnel of UV to give it enough exposure to start killing things. So that's typically not the application we're talking. People think of it that way, but in ducts, UV doesn't really work that way. When ASHRAE recommends it, it's upper room. Think of a hospital waiting room where people are coughing with TB is the typical example, and you're trying to do some general controls, so it's irradiating that upper area of the room over a longer period of time.
Correct. It's pretty much doing a single location is where it's being effective.
Great, and we've got time for about one more question here. If list end product says spray, does that mean it can be used in a sprayer? We're looking at sprayers and foggers, understanding that foggers will present additional safety controls.
All right, I didn't hear the first part of the sentence correctly.
If list end product says spray,
list.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know the answer to that. I think that a lot of products can be used because it's just an application method of the product. So I don't think it matters depending. But yes, I do agree with that. It does create additional exposure issues for individuals using the product.
And we have, you know, when you're creating a spray or a mist or a fog, you're changing the exposure dynamic, and as Michelle indicated, so you have to look at that. But the other thing is, you look at what the application method is, and a lot of times they'll say, get a surface wet, and let it stay wet for 5 minutes. Some of the technologies that allow for efficient spraying or coverage put a very thin layer of the disinfectant, and we have found in monitoring cleaning efforts that when they fog a surface, it puts such a thin layer that it evaporates in like 30 seconds, and so you don't get the residency time. And so then if you're having to go back and refog to keep it wet, why didn't you just spray it and wipe it to begin with? So we've had cases where they've used foggers, and gotten rid of the foggers and gone back to conventional sprayers because they couldn't get the wetness time on the surface. So I think it's some of those practical applications to look at. Yes, they're more efficient to deliver it to the surface, but is it enough?
Okay, great. And there's a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to today, and we'll try to follow up with as many of you as we can. I do want to quickly highlight that the second of this webinar series will be a week from today, also at 11 a.m. Pacific time. We'll be covering the importance and challenges of managing employees and altering their behavior to reduce risk. So if you haven't signed up for that one yet, we will include a link to register for that webinar in the follow-up email we'll send out yesterday with a copy of this recording. So thank you all so much, and thanks Ben and Michelle for presenting, and we'll hopefully see you all next week.
Thank you.